Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on antiquities trafficking, transnational crime, and the art market. I'm Patrick Costello, and it's a real privilege to be moderating this discussion. This is an issue that I'm quite interested in and passionate about. I'd also like to thank Louise and the Antiquities Coalition for convening this timely and important conversation. In a moment, I'll yield the floor to my friend Louise Shelley, who's the director of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University. But first, I'd like to note that this conversation is being recorded, so participants should consider this an on-the-record meeting. When we turn to the questions from the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, please utilize the chat function. I'll read the questions aloud and then allow our distinguished group of scholars and researchers to respond. I'd also just like to introduce the rest of the panel we've convened this afternoon. We have Neil Brodie, who is a senior research fellow on the Endangered Archaeology of the Middle East and North Africa project at Oxford University. Neil has held a number of positions at the British School at Athens, Stanford University's Archaeology Center, the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge, where he served as the research director of the Illicit Antiquities Research Center. And he's also held a number of other distinguished appointments. Leila Hashmi is a postdoctoral researcher at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason. Her research focuses on illicit trade, human trafficking, and corruption in the Middle East and North Africa. And finally, last but certainly not least, we're joined by Ute Wartenberg, who is the president and research curator of the American Numismatic Society, which is the leading American organization dedicated to the study of coins and metals. And she's one of the world's leading experts on ancient coinage. It's great to have you all with us. I'll now yield the floor to Louise to set the foundation for the conversation. So Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. We want to welcome our large, diverse, and knowledgeable audience to our event today, Putting a Price on the Priceless, Measuring the Antiquities Trade in Data and Dollars. The discussion today is based on research that was done on a State Department grant from its counterterrorism branch. The speakers have all contributed to a new book that will be out at the end of the year that Dr. Leila Hashemi and I have edited, called Antiquities, Smuggling in the Real and the Virtual World, that'll be published by Routledge, and it's been put in the chat box. This event is being hosted within a policy school and is being sponsored jointly by TRAC, the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center, and the Antiquities Coalition. The Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center has in recent years devoted significant research efforts to using and applying big data analytics to help understand the dynamics of diverse forms of criminality. We also have a focus on illicit trade and have an illicit trade institute. We believe that only by understanding the dimensions and operations of markets can we develop better policies. Who is behind this trade? What types of actors are benefiting from it? Unfortunately, too little financial and human resources have been spent trying to understand the scale of the antiquities marketplace, and the work is very time-consuming. The other day in our practice call, I was talking with Neil Brodie, who was talking about sort of the insulting amounts of money that have been offered to some researchers to try and figure out the scale of this. The data on high-end marketplaces is not readily available, and the low-end market is massive and requires significant amount of time and effort to collect, as much of it is online. The data analysis that went into this project that we call the Classy project, Countering Looting of Antiquities in Syrian and Iraqi project, range from some relatively simple online monitoring of sales platforms to the application of complex tools developed by DARPA, the branch of DoD devoted to advanced and innovative technology, to probe the dark web. That dark web research did not reveal much. It confirmed the large marketplace for antiquities, primarily the less expensive ends of the market, is going online. In 2019, Dr. Brody co-authored a report for the European Commission, suggesting that the European antiquities market was between 64 to 318 million euros, and Europeans sell a minimum of 56 million euros in coin, or 300,000 coins annually. The results of our research showed very significant discrepancies with the RAND research report on antiquities in 2020 on both the size and composition of the antiquities market. In response to our queries, RAND researchers reported that although they discussed coins in their report, they have not included that market in their overall data. Our analyses of the dynamics of the coin market, as we'll follow in the discussion, show that it is one of the most vibrant online marketplaces, and the omission of this data from the total gives a very different view of the size and the trajectory of the antiquities market. Therefore, we come out with different conclusions. I will now turn over the floor to our highly skilled moderator, Patrick Costello of the Council on Foreign Relations, who, as he mentioned, has a passionate interest in the topic, and he will facilitate what I'm sure will be a lively exchange among our speakers. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Louise. I'm going to engage our distinguished panel of experts in conversation for a little while at the top of the program before we open it up to all of those who are on the line. So just to get us started, Louise, I note your point about the size and composition of the market and the opacity within the market. So I'd just like to pose this first to Uta, then Neil, then Leila. As you're researching this issue, how do you deal with this matter of opacity, and how do you measure the problem of antiquities looting and trafficking? So Uta, go to you first.
So, well, if I go first, and can you all hear me? Perfect. In fact, the question, that I and my colleague, who might or might not be on this talk, Barbie Dimitrichenko, asked ourselves when we were reading these various figures that we all read in the press, how do we know this? It's one of these really interesting questions. And with coins, I always felt, and this is one of the advantages of the coin market, and one that I would really praise, is that it's really open access. We have tools such as coin archives, where you can literally look this up. And this is not a new thing. This has been running since 2000, where at least the high-end market is captured. I was really always curious about the low-end market, because I did wonder, every time I talk to a numismatist and say, but what about eBay? Any person that's vaguely serious says, I've never bought a coin on eBay. And I'm thinking, that, looking at the sheer mass there. And so what Barbie and I ventured on was just to literally count coins. And I think our project, and I won't go at all into detail here, but it really showed the sheer size of this market in quantities here. And some of these figures, if I just look this up now, is like that we have perhaps, and we took an extremely conservative sort of approach to this, how much was actually offered, because there were many lots, there were fakes, but basically there were provenance coins, there were coins we sold. But it seems that on eBay alone, just looking at ancient coins, that we got the impression that over 2 million coins are being offered in that category, whatever they were, maybe even 2.5 million, of which a significant number was sold. And actually, looking at the numbers that came out, and again, we looked at these quite carefully, and you can take a higher and a lower end, but we were looking at, sort of anything between in the 40 millions to almost 100 million in sales just on the ancient front, which of course excludes all the archaeological other material like medieval. And these are numbers where you begin to think, wow, small coins. And here there was this wonderful quote in the Wall Street Journal at some point saying, the idea there's a shadowy mass of collectors interested in purchasing crap that they can never sell again is absolutely ludicrous. Nobody wants esoteric, untraceable numismatics. Actually, I can assure you they do. We might not know them, but they do. And this is, I think, it's a huge problem, and the only thing I can say, time consuming and money needed is really there. And I think both the collectors archaeologists and the trade should have a joint interest in looking at this particular question to get some real figures out here. And I think what Barbie and I attempted is really a first attempt here.
Thank you. Neil, how do you approach this, this in your own research?
Well, I don't approach it unless I have to. I think it's a bit of a fool's game, really, to try and quantify the value of the market. There are too many missing variables. What generally happens, somebody comes along and wants to do some policy report, really. And the first thing they say is, we need statistics describing the size of the market or the value of the market. And I say, well, that's a waste of time. You know, can't we do something a bit more productive? And the answer is, oh, no, we really need statistics describing the, you know, the size and value of the market. So you can spend, you know, several weeks or months of your time coming up with some ballpark estimates. And then everybody starts arguing about the ballpark estimates and having webinars such as this one, arguing about the ballpark estimates. And we could all be spending our time doing more productive things. I think particularly we could be spending our time trying to quantify the damage caused by the illicit trade. We can start looking at individual sites now. I mean, we've got the techniques to look at individual sites and estimate how much money were made by the people looting the sites, so we know how much money is being generated locally. We can try and trace where the money is going to. So there are much better things to be doing than trying to research the kind of the global value of the illicit trade. And I say personally, I won't do it unless I'm more or less told to do it by some policy people.
Layla, Neil, I appreciate your frankness there. Layla, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I also appreciate my fellow panelists. I think it's important to note that when we talk about antiquities and cultural property, we're dealing with both tangible and intangible heritage. So it's not just the objects themselves, but the cultures, peoples, and histories they represent. We're also discussing a broad range of items, including art, coins, sculptures, cuneiform, monuments, and other historical artifacts. But I think we can measure the problem, as Neil said, in terms of its destruction, right? So the destruction of common heritage and our understanding of history, an erasure of culture, history, preventing our understanding of social development and the past. We also see convergence with other forms of transnational crime and illicit trade. Links to terrorism and extremist activity. Looting and trafficking thrive in conflict situations, and the proceeds of this illicit trade is often used to fund violence and terrorism, so it really becomes this harmful cycle. And we also see a democratization of the trade through technology, more specifically the internet and online payments. So the overall value of the trade is difficult to measure, as Neil mentions, but the use of automated and relatively simple tools such as web scrapers or other technology allows researchers to collect large amounts of data on marketplace listings in a much more efficient manner. I can go into that sort of process in a second, but amazing work is being done analyzing satellite imagery. It's being done by Neil and his team and others to detect looting at sites through spatial databases. And then I think it's important to point out that tech is used in both to facilitate this trade and to investigate it. So looting and trafficking of antiquities is a low risk and high reward crime. The internet has democratized the trade, and we currently have 4 billion social media users worldwide. With a low barrier to entry, online marketplaces allow any individual interested in cultural heritage to collect information and even purchase these items at relatively affordable costs. And because the antiquities trade is a gray market with a mixing of licit and illicit goods, these transactions are often completed with impunity. With the shift to online marketplaces and social media, much of the data on the illicit antiquities trade is now publicly available, which is promising. However, like with any data, we should be very clear about what we're quantifying. We need to be upfront about what our data and study limitations are. Frankly, as Neil was pointing out, I don't think there's a way to quantify the whole market, or that might not be the most constructive route forward. So the more specific our research can be, and the more clear we can be with our research, the better.
Great, thanks. I've got a lot of other questions, but I want to jump to one question that was just put in the chat by Jan Joris Visner. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. And it's on the matter of free ports. So how do free ports come into play? And I know that this is a particular concern in Europe, but where beyond Europe are we seeing free ports utilized to further this illicit activity? Layla, why don't we go to you? We'll go in reverse order. Layla, Neil, then Uta.
Sure. I think this also relates to this idea of how we can measure the market. So the illegal art market's difficult to detect or investigate because the antiquities market is gray, like I mentioned before, and because it's illicit. So it's also further obfuscated through the use of free ports or free trade zones where objects are laundered through the creation of false documents and records. Free ports allow a high level of privacy and are duty or tax-free, making them safe havens for warehousing or transporting stolen art. And then it's important to note here that most antiquities are sold with vague or no provenance at all, which is also facilitated by these free ports. Without knowing the source and ownership history of an artifact, it's really difficult to gather accurate and reliable data. And this point really can't be overstated. This lack of provenance or clear provenance for objects is probably one of the biggest problems plaguing the market.
All right, Neil, do you have any thoughts on the matter? And then we'll turn to Uta.
Yeah, I don't know about free ports. I mean, it was a big thing, well, in the 1990s, I suppose, and before that, obviously, the Swiss free ports were being used to launder material out of, well, Italy, Greece, Egypt, wherever. But the Italians and the Swiss did a very good job of closing all that down. Over the past 20 years, it's obvious there's been a lot of material coming through Dubai from various Middle Eastern countries. In time and time again, you will see police actions or customs actions involving material which has come through people in Dubai. Interesting, recently there seems to have been a bit of a shift out to Bangkok, including at least one Dubai dealer moving to Bangkok. Why that is, I don't know. Presumably it's something about, you know, must be something to do with the trading environment there, the regulatory environment. But I mean, a lot of the trade that we know about, and particularly in things like coins, small objects, I mean, you know, they don't need to go anywhere near a free port, really. So, you know, free ports are there and they're obviously important, but they're not all there is. You know, there's a big trade outside the free ports.
So, Uta, do you agree with Neil's sentiment there that this isn't so much a problem with the coinage market?
You know, I comment only on coins, and so Freeport is something you read about it. I can't comment on whether Freeports are a phenomenon or not. Certain individuals involved in Freeports, but this was at an earlier point. You read about Freeports, so I have nothing to say on coins and Freeports, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. We're going to open it up to the audience in just a minute. But when I think about this issue, a lot of where materials are being looted from are quite fragile states. And how I think about this is almost through the lens of the peace and security lens, and losing irreplaceable historic data. And I think part of creating a sustainable post-conflict situation is creating a common narrative about the past, not just the conflict, but going back further. So I'm wondering, and Louise, I welcome your thoughts on this as well. How does this looting and antiquities trafficking complicate matters there? So Louise, why don't we go to you first, and then we'll go to Layla, and then Uta and Neil if they want to weigh in as well.
I think, as we've talked about in our book and on our project, is that taking objects and looting them removes the context from which these objects come from. And therefore, you lose the historical record, you lose the ability to interpret the object in context. And that is just of absolutely critical importance. And as we have greater skills of archaeologists who can do more and more with placing objects in context, the looting is on such a massive scale, especially in relationship to coins, as Uta has mentioned, that we lose so much of our understanding of what went on in the place and the trade relations that existed in antiquity. And in the book, I noticed we have one of our specialists, Nathan, who wrote about, Nathan Elkins, about managing to trace coins back that have been looted to some kind of relative geographic locale. And that's very important in understanding where these objects are from and what went on within a region and a sub-region and in the period of Roman rule and others. So I'm not an archaeologist, but I've learned to appreciate what context means. And this is something that is very key and so tragic about the problem of looting.
Thanks. Layla, what are your thoughts? And then we'll go to Neil.
Yeah, so I think in terms of measuring the harm, there's a danger of measuring only in a dollar amount. A low value crime is still a crime and should take place with impunity and should be punished. There's also a correlation with cultural trafficking and other harms. Trafficking is both a symptom and a cause of various other social harms that threaten national and global security and human rights. So in terms of causing harms to the legitimate art market, this includes a devaluation of genuine objects through the trafficking of counterfeit items. The art market is also harmed because these items are lost forever, demonstrating the need for more efforts to document items for preservation. Trafficking also poses a tremendous threat to global security. We now know that the proceeds from illicit antiquities have been used to fund violent extremism and terrorism, and that the trade in looted antiquities is often facilitated by organized crime groups to move objects across borders. Trafficking occurs in conjunction with corruption and converges with other forms of illicit trade, such as the trafficking of drugs and weapons, money laundering, and other financial crimes. The persistence of looting and trafficking represents flaws in national and international structures that threaten the global economy. According to the World Economic Forum, in 2019, economic leakages from, this is just the total illicit trade, caused an annual drain on the global economy of $2.2 trillion. That's nearly 3% of the world's economy. That means that if illicit trade were a country, its economy would be larger than Brazil, Italy, and Canada. Illicit trade diverts revenue from the legal economy, negatively impacting economic growth and development, and it also threatens the rule of law. Finally, trafficking of cultural heritage poses harms to human rights. These are irreplaceable and often high-value objects that are being sold with no documentation, as I mentioned earlier. The loss of these items signals a loss of historical and cultural records that can never be regained. These injustices and crimes need to be made publicly known in order to promote responsible consumption of art in the same way that we have seen more buyer awareness around other trades such as ivory and timber. We must make buyers aware of the often unintended negative consequences of their purchases and address the demand side of the trade.
Neil, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I mean, I think building on what Louise said, we have to remember that lots of these periods or episodes of extreme looting, if you like, are associated with conflict in war zones. And that's not the only thing that's happening. In these countries, we're seeing universities depopulated, as it were. People are leaving their positions, leaving the country, people are being killed. So university research can collapse along with the looting. So it's a double whammy in a way. The raw material of your historical research is being shipped wholesale out the country, and the people who could do the historical research aren't there to do it anymore. So your history gets handed over to people in a foreign country to make of it what they will. And they've got their own histories to tell, and they tell their own histories. And so the people whose country the material is coming from, they remain dumb in a way, really. They're losing the material of their own history, and they're losing the voice to tell that history with. So it's a tragedy, really.
Indeed, it is a tragedy. Uta, do you have anything to add before I turn to a question from the audience?
The interesting point about looting is, and I work now in Western Turkey in Balad, which is near Miletus, is where, of course, the looting, you see it in archaeological sites and so on, but it is done by people in these countries, you know, so the same people trying to protect their cultural heritage are also then through other different types of, you know, might be different level, but looting. And then there is this whole movement. And the question is really how could you explain this to, you know, villagers and people like this? This is not really of interest. And there are in Turkey in particular, there are certain attempts, for example, with coins that the local museums, and this was something that surprised me, just buy these coins directly in order to keep them as least locally, because this importance is even the smallest horrible little Roman coins. And this is an argument often made by collectors that, you know, if a museum has already this, why do you need more of them? But actually it is exactly the mass, in particular for coin numismatics, mass data is really what tells you an amazing story. Louise referred to this. But at the same time in here, if I can be the contrarian a little bit, you know, a lot of the information that we have about coinage comes from, you know, collectors that have put stuff together over the last like 300-400 years, you can say at this point. And so we wouldn't even know what we're looking at actually if it wasn't for all this material coming out. And so I think this is really where those of us in the coin field are really torn. It is an incredibly difficult, also emotional subject. You know, how can you deal with the fact that people will always collect it for 500 years. There seem to be always people looting, and we're trying to protect cultural property. So how is it going to work? And I think this is really the challenge here, where policy hasn't really completely moved in the right direction, I feel.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to a question from Jennifer Smith, and I'm going to read it verbatim. She asks, how do you think the new NDAA, Anti-Money Laundering Act regulations enacted by the US earlier this year will affect, this just jumped on me, will affect illicit trade of antiquities? And I'm assuming that the NDAA provision she's referring to is the Corporate Transparency Act that was part of the FY20 NDAA. So, Louise, I see you nodding along. Why don't you give your take on that, and then we'll go to Layla.
I think there are a lot of people in the audience that are specialists in this, but I think that there is not enough specificity in reference to illicit trade of antiquities in these new provisions. And I think there's much more being thought about banking, real estate, as opposed to the art market. And therefore, I think much more needs to be extended in this area beyond what was initially enacted.
Layla, you have any thoughts on the statutes that went into effect earlier this year?
Yeah, I think the more transparency we can sort of have in this trade, the better. Agreeing with Louise that more can be done, but already we are at a great disadvantage in terms of the records and sort of what we know about these items. And I think that in particular, there is merit in trying to follow the money and following financial records. But I think first we really need to tackle the issue of a lack of provenance. And I saw a question about like where these objects come from. So I think the antiquities trade is unique in that it's a bit more difficult to track.
Right.
I just noticed in the chat box that Michael Loughnane, who is also one of the contributors to our collection, is saying, well, the US is trying to figure it out now. Planning is underway. And I think that's why a seminar like this one is so important, because we've got to show that this is a priority and not lesser than some of the other priorities that are being established in response to the NDA.
Great. I'm going to jump back to Dirk because this is related to Dirk's question. He's asking to what extent high-end auction houses are still complicit in selling on provenance antiquities and museums and buying it. So Uta, why don't I toss that to you first and then Neil.
Talking again, I don't want to talk really about antiquities as something. I talk about coins specifically, and it's a very difficult question here. What are we talking about on provenance? This is already the first problem. You know, some people look at 1970 as a rule, other people looking at not violating MOU rules. So, but if you're looking at something that's brand new out of the ground, I would say this is still definitely in the coin market something that is quite common. But of course, I would think that the auction houses in questions would say they're following US law. And so here we have, again, this incredible conflict between, you know, is it okay to, let's say, take something out of Turkey as long as it doesn't break US law in the import in particular, if we know as little as possible about it. So I think the answer to this is yes, there is still an issue.
Neil, what are your thoughts?
Lots of thoughts.
That's why we invited you.
I know. It depends what we're talking about, really. Do high-end auction houses sell objects which are fresh out of the ground? Well, I'd be quite surprised if they do. Do high-end auction houses sell objects were looted 20, 30 years ago? Almost certainly, yes. There are examples. We're probably all aware of the recent example of Christie's auction house in London selling through private, not public auction, through private sale, a looted cuneiform tablets of Hobby Lobby Corporation in the United States, which I think was subsequently seized by US Customs, I think. I think it's been returned to Iraq now, and Hobby Lobby is suing Christie's to recover the purchase price. And there are lots of examples, smaller objects, which are shown to be looted back in the late 20th century, early years of this century even, being sold as auction houses. So certainly they're selling what we might consider to be recently looted objects, but as I say, not fresh out of the ground objects.
Leila and Luis, do you have anything to add before we turn to another question?
I think it's important to kind of point out this distinction between a sort of high-end market or these auction houses, and really understand the trade in terms of auction houses and galleries, sort of social media platforms like I was mentioning earlier, and then marketplaces, and how sometimes these can overlap, but they're often quite distinct and different. So for instance, for the Classy project at Track, we were looking at all of these, but mostly at the social media and marketplace listings. With the auction houses, you have sort of a buy-in, right? There's a vetting process that allows a vendor to sell on that platform, versus on social media, like anyone can sort of post an antiquity on Facebook and then sell the artifact via Facebook Marketplace or through, WhatsApp or some other payment method. And I did want to point out that in our Classy project, we didn't see any activity on the dark web, but with some of these auction houses, we saw the acceptance of cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin, with auction houses, which, not to say that using cryptocurrency is, illegal in and of itself, but I did think that was an interesting development as we did our research.
So building on that, there was an announcement from Facebook that it would ban the sale of historical artifacts. And I'm just wondering, you said in your research you hadn't seen much activity on the dark web, but as social media companies do increasingly crack down on this, how can governments work with private companies to prevent antiquity sales without pushing them further onto the dark web? Because as social media companies start to crack down, I just think that's the natural avenue.
Right, absolutely. So it becomes sort of like a balloon problem, right? So the short answer is we don't see evidence of sale on the dark web because vendors don't need to really use it. They want to reach the widest audience possible, so they continue to sell primarily on the open web versus the dark web, because they've been able to do so with relative impunity. To put it simply, they don't need to use the dark web because they don't need to. However, if we do see successful implementation of regulation in the open market, we might see a shift to the dark web. Like I said, we did see some evidence of vendors accepting cryptocurrency, specifically Bitcoin, for payment in goods. And we do see a sort of progression of reaching the widest audience as possible, for instance, on a Facebook page, or let's go with social media on Facebook, and then quickly identifying buyers that are interested, and then going into encrypted channels such as WhatsApp to be able to obfuscate that trade.
Thanks. I want to pivot to Nicole's question. I'm going to pose this first to Neil, and she's asking if you believe that additional public community engagement might make a difference in forming local communities about these issues, about the importance of cultural heritage, about the shape of the illicit market. Just if you were doing a public relations campaign, what would your thoughts on broadening the audience for this?
I'd broaden the audience in Manhattan if I could. Educate them about the importance of cultural heritage. I think when people ask these questions, I think the idea is if around sites which are being looted, people are not aware of the either the historical value or the potential economic value of cultural sites, archaeological sites. And so we need to do more to engage people around sites. Where I've worked in the past, I find normally that opinions are divided. People who run hotels and cafes who make money out of tourists are all in favour of protecting archaeological sites. But farmers who own the land in which the archaeological sites are situated are far less enthusiastic about protecting them. Whether we could target the people like the farmers, I don't know. But of course, the problem is all this goes out the window in a conflict zone. The communities fragment, economies collapse. And I think in these situations, no matter how much public engagement you've carried out, it's just gone really. I think there's very, very little left. People are desperate. They're looking to survive. And they're not going to be looking at the potential historical value of the site down the road. So.
Do you have anything to add on this before I pivot to another question?
Just in my relatively limited experience with trying to educate people, I would second what Neil says, in particular the importance of landowners. And I have to say the cases that I experienced was also that the people actually working on the land are not the owners, and the owners are often sort of nebulous individuals who are quite far away, who seem to be protecting. So you have that same level, and you can see that actually often that, the people just employed. And so I think that makes it increasingly difficult to explain, the importance of this, when many of the locals really keen to protect these sites.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pick up on a thread that was in the chat about enforcement and prosecution. I'd note that up in New York, we've got Matt Bagdanos, who's the chief of the Antiquities trafficking unit in the Manhattan DA's office. I believe that's the only such department in the country, and he's zealously going after alleged looted artifacts. And I'm wondering if you do see a more aggressive posture with other police forces across the country and across the world, but if you also see, as you look at the marketplace, if this more aggressive posture, when where prosecutors are building cases against alleged offenders that could result in jail time, is having a deterrent effect, whereas before offenders could just deal with the civil and financial consequences. So Louise, why don't I toss this to you, just about the role of law enforcement here?
I think there is active law enforcement in New York, but I think there is also active law enforcement on the federal level in Washington. I know that some of the people that we have on this webinar work for DHS and are deeply concerned about these issues. They've consulted people who are on this call, but they've also consulted other people that we work with and try and develop a high level of expertise in this. And as was pointed out, there is a concern in going forward of how money service businesses are designated and handled, and that's part of the money laundering community, and we have people from that community involved as this becomes an area in which government, not just in the US, but elsewhere, are aware that art and antiquities are being used to launder money, because it does go on through social media. And as Nathan Elkin had put in the chat box, a very interesting comment on his analysis of how it was also going on through an online antiques auction site for coins. So this is something that doesn't get the resources it needs from law enforcement, but there are certainly very passionate people involved in this issue.
Great, thanks. Leila, you've spent a lot of time looking at this too. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. So I definitely think that law enforcement is really important and a critical element in tracking this trade. I also think it's important to point out that the scope of responsibility sort of lies beyond the government in a lot of senses. The rise in online trade since the early 2000s necessitates increased involvement by the private sector as well, and all segments of society. There's widespread evidence of the sale of antiquities on platforms such just Facebook, Etsy, and eBay, which leads to a need for tech regulation. So actually, Patrick, you mentioned earlier the ban on Facebook of historical artifacts, pretty recent in an update in their community standards. And while promising, the ban has not yet been properly implemented. So similar to Facebook's track record with banning other content such as child pornography and human trafficking, these illicit activities persist on the platform despite updates in company policy. Groups are still openly or privately advertising cultural objects for sale and even sharing looting tips. Antiquities enthusiasts, metal detectorists, which I think someone mentioned in the chat, and other groups use online forums and social networking platforms to discuss objects and the general trade. And then I think a really important part of law enforcement is just having enough resources for proper training and really looking at all levels of analysis. So policymakers must understand the importance of local, national, and international cooperation because we're dealing with a transnational issue. So as part of the Classy project at TRAC, our research team developed trainings for law enforcement and customs that included both theoretical and practical components. The curriculum involved working through examples and case studies and teaching the importance of open source and other digital investigations to detect present-day trade. So we really need to train law enforcement investigators, give them the funding and the resources that they need to effectively detect and disrupt the trade, connect them to subject matter experts like the wonderful panelists that we have here who can facilitate and inform investigations.
Great, thanks. To our friends on the line, I still encourage you to put your questions in the chat. I will make every effort to get to everyone's questions. One interesting development a couple of years ago was the establishment of a new reserve group in the Army with the aim of protecting antiquities and important cultural sites in war zones. And it's based out of the Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command down at Fort Bragg, and it was inspired by the movie Monuments Men. I thought that was pretty interesting development. Serving as a scholarly liaison for military commanders and local authorities to help secure cultural heritage in regions involved in conflict and rebuild societies in war and disaster zones. And as you look out across the horizon, Neil, to Louise and Layla, welcome your thoughts. Are any other countries setting up similar task forces to address this issue? This seems pretty novel.
Are you asking me first?
Go ahead, Neil. Yeah, you can go first. I didn't.
Yeah, I don't know really, and I don't know if I support the initiative. I think soldiers in conflict zones have got better things to do than protect archaeological sites. The problem with the illicit trade, it's a demand-led phenomenon. We need to tackle demand. We need to stop people buying and selling these. And if people stop buying them, selling them, people wouldn't be looting them, and we wouldn't need to position soldiers around archaeological sites. I mean, it seems to me that's the issue we should be talking about, not asking other countries to commit soldiers to protecting archaeological heritage. I think that's the wrong road to be going down, to be quite honest. I know it's a well-intentioned move, but I think it's the wrong way to be going.
That is a very fair point, Neil. Layla, Louise, or Uta, do either the three of you have anything to contribute on this particular question?
I wanted to say something about the law enforcement versus what is working quite extensively with law enforcement. Some of them I see are there today here listening. And one of the most frustrating things is that it's the quantity that has to be examined on any given day must be, and then the tiny resources, let's say in customs, for example, but then also everywhere else is there. And I think this is generally frustrating. You have these sort of rules that are supposed to be enforced, whatever they are, and then there isn't really enough manpower as well as really expertise here. And I think one of the key things here is, if I wanted to do that, is to increase this. But then I've become quite pessimistic on this front, and I'm looking at this, and here coming back again to our eBay research, is that it would be so much easier really if these enormous large like Facebook and eBay, but also Amazon would stop selling at least certain types of categories that are posing some of these problems. Like unclean coins. This is always one of my big pets, which is a huge amount on these markets. And there's no expertise here needed. There's just manpower to enforce it, but there's just almost no way to do that. But it could be just stopped from one day to the next if eBay did not promote this type of operation on an ongoing basis, which is bad for the market overall. I mean, we have this question always about big auction houses, but actually, if the research that really shocked me when it came out, what I did is that eBay and these other online Etsy and whatever else is probably a much, much larger amount of money, at least for coins, than the few auction houses that are being always relatively heavily scrutinized. Not that I say that shouldn't be, but my impression is that it's much easier just to do this on eBay. So really, it's that conflict that has to be tackled.
Great, thank you. I see a number of other questions have popped in the chat. Why don't we go to Lawrence's question first? And it's just a basic resourcing question. How can we beef up resources on this? Neil, why don't you take a swing at that first, and I'll go to Louise and Layla.
I would advocate a Pigovian tax personally. I don't know what Lawrence thinks of that.
Lawrence, feel free to respond in the chat. Louise?
Sorry, well, I'll just enlarge it. It's charge. It would be taxing antiquities sales in places such as the United States and the United Kingdom and so on, and using the proceeds of that tax to fund countermeasures, whatever those countermeasures would be. I think that's pretty much what the argument is.
Great.
Brodie will correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, Lawrence, actually, if you could, if you've got it at your fingertips and want to share the article that you wrote advocating for that, I think everyone would find that useful. Layla, you have any thoughts on this? And then we'll go to Louise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of just resources for law enforcement and trainings in that respect, and then also, I mean, I guess this is partially monetary, but also just having long-term research. So being able to conduct longer-term analysis of the trade that isn't sort of running out of funding very quickly. And then in terms of non-monetary resources, I think just raising public awareness. We see a lot of these objects being sold on Etsy, for instance, as craft or hobby goods. So I think a lot of users are sort of purchasing these items without really knowing the tremendous harm that they're causing. So I think the more that we can kind of promote this public awareness, just like I was mentioning earlier, we have, I think, a really, the public has really been made aware of the damage done by, blood diamonds or the timber or wildlife trafficking. And if we can bring that same awareness to antiquities, I think that would be beneficial because people would know what harm is being done by their actions.
Thanks. Louise, do you want to add anything before we pivot to the next question?
The question is on resources. And when you under-resource something, then that's where the criminality migrates. And I think one thing that was brought up in the chat box that's important to talk about is how there are different markets. And as Layla was talking about, the democratization of this antiquities market has just been enormous, which means that there are many middle-class buyers. And this is really key because they may want them for school projects or some remnant of antiquity. And I think they do not understand how this is fueling a global illicit market. Elise Bean, who's a top specialist in financial crime, has written in the chat box that antiquities dealers have been added to the list of entities that have to develop AML programs. And it's also important to add art dealers to this list and coin dealers. And also, but I think what our argument that we're making here that others are making is that there is an enormous role of social media and online platforms. And as we think about our legislation and how we're protecting against money laundering, we need to be thinking in broader terms than just the real world, but what is going on in the virtual world.
Great, thank you. I was muted. Neil, you want to add something? I see you just raised two.
Yeah, no, this point about middle class people I mean, it's interesting. I've been thinking for a long time, if you watch any kind of, particularly US-made television program, whether it's a drama or a comedy or anything else, they don't seem able to make one without on the set they've got a couple of antiquities of some description in the background as decoration, and whether they're real or genuine, I don't know. But there's this consistent message being sent out through television that if you want a kind of a reasonably trendy suburban home, you need an antiquity of some sort, whether it be a little Buddha, a Greek pot, an African mask, you know, it's all there. And it just comes in every single day. It's streamed into your living room. You know, this is what decorations are. This is how you should be living. So when I said somewhat flippantly before, you know, we need public education in Manhattan, I think we need it in Hollywood as well. And get these set designers and say, really, they're sending out wrong messages here. You know, they need to get the game in order.
I'm wondering if you were seeing increased use of antiquities in people's Zoom backgrounds. I mean, I have a signed baseball behind me. That's just me. So let's actually talk a bit about the current state of affairs. You know, we are doing this via Zoom because of the pandemic. We're unable to convene in person. And I know that early on, due to quarantine, stay-at-home orders, that museums were kept shut for months, and that there were reports early on that they were considering selling off portions of their collections to maintain operations and cover operating costs. So just anecdotally, as you kind of look across the landscape, how has the pandemic complicated this? So Neil, why don't I go to you first, and I'll go to Leila, Luis, and then Uta.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I've noticed most, I suppose, in my little area is, you know, the pandemic increases unemployment, and unemployment goes up and looting goes up. You know, it's like a conflict scenario, but different. And it just comes back to the same old story. You know, people are buying and selling these things. People are going to loot them. Again, I think it's the wrong strategy to thinking that we suddenly need to start guarding sites in all around the world because of COVID. You know, that necessity shouldn't have been there. We should have taken action years ago to stop the trade. You know, and this is another avoidable outcome, basically.
Leila?
Yeah, I agree. I think that during the pandemic, we've seen a tremendous increase in online purchasing. Actually, Louise and I are working on an entire project looking at counterfeit personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals. And so we're buying really almost everything online. We'd been doing so already, but the pandemic has definitely made this, has increased this, and also increased the opportunity for criminals to take advantage of this, right? And to kind of capitalize on this idea and increase counterfeits or substandard goods. And so I think this increases the need to develop regulations that address the specific challenges of the online trade. Efforts should be made to decrease demand for antiquities with questionable provenance and to promote responsible collection of cultural objects. But I think we also just need a sort of generally more conscious consumption of everything that we're purchasing online. And that buyers should be made aware that a lack of due diligence promotes not only the destruction of heritage, but also the production of forgeries, and that all together these can fund terrorism and conflict, as Neil was pointing out. I think also this idea that many are struggling so much during the pandemic really promotes this idea of looting in source countries.
Great, thanks. Louise, you have anything to add?
I just wanted to follow up on what Leila was saying about, you know, financial difficulties, but also this issue of terrorist funding. And we very much didn't want to put that in, you know, the publicity for today's event, as that seems to overshadow everything when you talk about terrorism. But there were, as we were following links, and Leila was doing this on Facebook, she was finding all kinds of very curious friends of some of the sellers. And so the links that go back to the region and the licensing agreements that were given out by ISIS at the height of its power show that there are really pernicious actors that are behind some of this trade. And therefore, as has been said in the chat box, I think people need to do a much broader educational program on the cultural harm, the financial harm, and to think of this in a faceted way, as well as destruction of history and our future understanding of it.
Great, thanks, Louise. We've got approximately 5 minutes left by my clock, and I want to get to Jan's question here, and we're going to do a quick round robin. We'll go to Uta first, Neil, Layla, then Louise. And it's just, looking at which is worse, the illegal sales by dealers or the need to increase transparency within the marketplace itself. So we'll go in basically counterclockwise how I see you on my screen.
That's me, right? Yeah, that's the question I'm asking myself here. It's definitely what this whole COVID situation, everyone being stuck at home, showed, in particular from again, speaking purely on the numismatic end, but I've seen it in other areas as well. But is that people and is this human nature? Do they enjoy collecting, right? So the question of, does the man try and just explain to everyone that it's illegal, in particular when there is probably millions of coins out there now that at least in some shape or form have some kind of legality there, is to me what the most important question is: how can we stop future looting? Because that's really where that important information that Louise came up with. And I see, yes, I think it's Peter Tomper put it in the chat about the portable antiquities scheme, but I think that even countries like Greece, in particular Turkey, with this idea of just buying coins directly from locals and so on, is something that I'm particularly interested in. I would sort of say anecdotally, one can see that COVID has definitely made it more difficult to move some of this material around from what one can see. But people buying it, I think this is a lesson to think that it's going to stop by just sort of making it more difficult also. I think it's not going to work.
Thank you. Neil, what do you think?
Well, following up the British portable or the English portable antiquities scheme, which I suppose I need to, it's there to encourage people to report, but it doesn't necessarily make them report. As far as I know, there have been no studies whatsoever showing what percentage of fines are reported. My own ongoing research shows that only a small percentage of fines are reported. It could be doing more to promote the destruction of archaeological sites than to save archaeological sites. But until we get some serious research into this problem, I don't think we're in any position to make any statements whatsoever. And this really does cycle back to the original problem: is where is all the research? We've got this very poorly researched problem. No one really is conducting research into it. The funding isn't there to support the research. The people with the necessary skills aren't participating. It's a massive problem, really. We need a lot more funding for research. And we need research by lots of disciplines, really, not just archaeologists and numismatists. We need criminologists, economists, policy people, a whole range of people, financial people, military people. Sorry, I forgot what the original question was now. I felt a little brand.
No, that's expanding the people who are involved in the research. It's an extremely important thing. I'm glad you brought it up, Neil. Layla, we'll go to you, and then it looks like we're going to get a couple of minutes, so we'll close out where we started with Louise.
Yeah, I think with the increase in online trade, I don't know if there is necessarily more transparency. I think that there's more data out there, and sort of as I mentioned before, researchers need to be very clear about their data collection and analytic methods. So what data is being gathered, what are the limitations, how is the data processed and analyzed, and how does the evidence or data support the study's findings? These are all very basic sort of research questions. And then I mentioned several limitations to this as well. I think that we sort of lack a common or set methodology, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have ideas as to how we can conduct this research, but as many of us have mentioned in this webinar, we sort of lack the resources to be able to have a sort of sustainable and long-term approach to this. So I don't know, it's sort of a double-edged sword. Like, we have more online sales, which gives us more publicly available data, and we need to have proper mechanisms to be able to measure and analyze this that is interoperable, I guess, I would say, in terms of being able to share across academia, law enforcement, customs, and all these different sectors.
Great, thanks. Louise, you'll have the closing comments before we zoom out.
All I can say is that it's been thrilling to be part of this discussion and to have such a knowledgeable audience that has joined us from around the world. And I think that there needs to be some much more critical thinking, because while we've talked about primarily the problem of this classy project, which focused on Iraq and Syria, this is just one region of the world that has commanded a lot of attention and concern, but it's certainly not unique. And there are conflicts going on in other regions of the world, problems in Africa, problems in Latin America, Asia, and we need to be thinking much more broadly about how some of the problems and the analytical tools that we developed can be used to help advance this discipline. Or I can't call it this discipline, this problem, which needs a multidisciplinary approach to it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to my distinguished co-panelists. I certainly learned a lot this afternoon. I hope everyone else on the line did as well. And certainly set the foundation for future discussions and hopefully expanded scope of research. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.